Right, here we are. The response to the economic collapse, chapter 31. So we see all the things that led to the Great Depression, the causes of it. Now we got to see what the response to the economic collapse was. Our different sections here in chapter 31. We have our introduction, we've got our essential question here. How did the federal government respond to the economic collapse that began in 1929? We're going to see a couple of different responses, so we need to start thinking about those. We'll take a look at some of the ideological responses to the economic crisis. We'll talk about Herbert Hoover's conservative responses to the hard times, and then we'll talk about FDR launching his New Deal and the first 100 days in order to implement those government programs. Here's our vocab terms, the Bonus Army. This is a group of World War I veterans that ultimately traveled to Washington, D.C. in 1932 to get the early payment of the retirement bonus to help them through the hard economic times of the Great Depression. Ultimately, what they did was they occupied the Capitol building for a long time, and a pretty interesting story about the Bonus Army. We've got Hoovervilles. These are the shanty towns that started popping up around the United States that people lived in that really were displaced because of the Great Depression. And then we've got the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This is a government agency created by Congress to provide loans to banks, railroads, and businesses, and then eventually to farmers and public works projects. We've got the New Deal. This is FDR's domestic program from 33 to 39, which aimed to bring about immediate economic relief from the Great Depression. So this really was one of the biggest things that helped the United States rise from the Great Depression. And the first 100 days was the first 3 months when FDR and the Congress was implementing these things set forth by FDR's New Deal. And the idea was to provide relief, recovery, and reform from the Great Depression. So the first thing we need to talk about, and where you can find this information, is on pages 394 and 395. We got to know what ideology means, a term that you've probably heard, but maybe you're not quite sure what it means. And this is just basically a set of ideas and beliefs and values that form the basis of a social, economic, political philosophy or program. So really this is just a set of people's beliefs on certain subjects. One of those ideologies would be conservative ideology. This is someone who cherishes and seeks to preserve traditional customs and values. They prefer what we call the status quo. They don't like radical changes. They like things the way that they are. Then we've got the liberal, and this is someone who's committed to the expansion of liberty. Really, if that means changing some things, they're willing to do that. If the traditional ways aren't working, they need to come up with more progressive ways that would help them preserve people's liberty and freedom. And then of course we've got the radical, and this is somebody who's ready to turn things upside down if they have to. They want to make sweeping social, political, or economic changes in society, and they'll do it any way necessary, even if that means by revolting or creating a revolution. So here's the conservative response. They were generally opposed to government intervention. They felt that challenged their values. They preferred what we would call the status quo, or the current conditions, to abrupt changes. They said these things will work themselves out because they resisted calls for radical changes to the free enterprise system. They believed that this stuff would stabilize over time and then eventually begin to improve, and we see that here with this cycle. So we see the decline that happened in 1929, then we get to the panic, which, after a few years things actually got worse before they got better. But then they believe that the natural cycle is eventually a recovery, and then they just believe that this, as part of the capitalist system, was part of the business cycle, and that the lows that people were experiencing were simply a natural part of the economic capitalist economy. So this is what we see as the conservative response, more or less, was let it recover on its own. Okay, so that's something that we need to think about. Then we get to the liberal response, and they believe that the government should help. Liberals started out in believing that small government was the better government, but with the rise of big businesses during the Industrial Revolution, we see this change over time. And they believe that, if we let the system run as it is, that there was going to be, a negative thing happening here. They realized that limited government could do little to protect individuals, and that was the big thing, this idea of individuals need to have a voice, and the government could provide that for them from unsafe working conditions, monopolies, unsafe food and drugs. And we saw that during the Industrial Revolution when the government stepped in and passed laws to prevent this stuff. So when the Depression sets in, the liberals look to government to expand its powers, and by doing that they're going to protect individual liberties and freedom from hunger. And those individual liberties mean freedom from hunger and poverty. And one way they did that was the government funded construction projects meant to create jobs for the unemployed. So ultimately people would be employed by the government by doing things like creating a Hoover Dam, which would have long-lasting positive effects for large parts of society. And then we've got social welfare, and what this is programs that provide aid to those in need by raising taxes on corporations and the wealthy, and then taking those taxes and providing things like food stamps and welfare for people that were poor, hungry, and maybe even lost their house and things like that. Then we've got the radical response. These are the people that are like, the status quo is not working, we need to change it, even if that means through a revolution. And this is when we see the rise of the communists and the socialists, because they wanted to do away with the capital system. They said that capitalism is not working, we need a new way to do it. So communism, socialism was really on the rise during this time. And these ideas began to appeal to more and more people as the Great Depression wore on. So one of the things with communism that we have to understand is that the economic systems would move out of the marketplace, so we wouldn't just let it go. The government would have a role in the economy. And then you've got socialism, where wealth would be redistributed to people according to their needs. So that means that the super rich would have to give up part of their money to the super poor, and that would ultimately reduce the gap between the rich and the poor by kind of evening things out a little bit. So we see Herbert Hoover's conservative response to the hard times. He was, a big believer in, hey, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. This idea of self-reliance. If you work hard, you can make good things happen for yourself. He didn't believe that the federal government should do anything for the needy. He felt that his job was to simply generate optimism and restore confidence, and the way to do that was just to tell people and encourage people that through hard work and continued looking for work and things like that, that they could do better for themselves. But this depression wasn't like anything else that the world had seen. Due to the number of bank failures and things like that, even Herbert Hoover had to rethink how the government was going to react to this new thing. So here we have one of our vocab terms, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which issued government loans to banks, railroads, and other big businesses. So here we have government stepping in to try to fix this situation. He hoped that these loans would stimulate economic growth. But the fact of the matter was, people of the conservative ideology and the liberal ideology tended to criticize this strategy. So if you take a look on page 396 in your reading, you should see, you'll read about how and why they criticized this particular strategy. So then we've got the election of FDR. People were kind of like anybody but Hoover, and FDR was very inspirational. We see one of his most famous quotes here. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, and he was really inspirational for people in wanting to turn around the economic collapse and take a new bold look at how to respond to this. So he ran his presidential campaign on what we call the New Deal, and this was all about doing whatever he had to and whatever the government had to in order to help the needy. We call this bold and consistent experimentation. So he knew that quite possibly some of these things weren't going to work, but at least he was doing something and the government was doing something. And you see there how big he won the election by. It wasn't even close. So the first 100 days, this was the first 3 months of his presidency, and this is implementing those things with the New Deal. And what this was, it was intended to help the unemployed, tried to make farming profitable again, and it required companies issuing stock to provide a full and accurate information to investors. So if you were going to invest in the stock market, you knew how this company was doing, and you weren't just relying on stockbrokers to say, oh yeah, no, it's a great deal, you'll be fine, you're going to make a ton of money on this. So they really had to have this accurate information for investors. You know, if their company wasn't doing so good, the investor needed to have that information. So these were all part of the things that happened during the first 100 days of FDR's presidency with implementing his New Deal policies. So here are some of the laws, and the idea here is to be able to match what we've got. So you see all these different acts, and these are acts of a president, right? Actions of a president. And we see the first one, the Emergency Banking Act, and when we click on it, we see that this gave the government power to reopen banks. So big government, there it is, the reopening banks. The Beer Wine Revenue Act, well, you can imagine what that's all about. This was the legalization of the sale of alcohol. This went against prohibition. An amendment was passed in order to make it companies and businesses legal to sell and produce alcohol. The Reforestation Relief Act, guess what we're talking about? Establishing what we call the Civilian Conservation Corps, which provided work for young men, and that was working in national forests and things like that. We've got the Federal Emergency Relief Act. That was the relief projects to help the unemployed, and that was just simply they were creating things to employ people through the government. The Agricultural Adjustment Act set prices for farm crops so there wasn't a fluctuation. They could count on getting a certain amount of money for their crops. The Tennessee Valley Authority funded the construction of flood control dams throughout the state of Tennessee and a few other states. We see the Federal Securities Act that regulated the sales of stocks and bonds like we talked about earlier. The Homeowners Refinancing Act provide aid to family in danger of losing their homes. Similar stuff to what we've seen here in the past 5 to 10 years here in the U.S. You know, you're going to lose your house, the government steps in and helps you not lose your house. And then we've got the National Industrial Recovery Act, establishes Public Works Administration to supervise building projects like the Hoover Dam. And then we've got the Banking Act of 1933. And this ensures depositors from losses when banks fails. And we talked about this earlier with you know, what happens when the bank doesn't have your money, and this ensures that people will have their money and the bank and the government will back up those deposits that they've made to the banks. So this is all the stuff that happened in the first 100 days. You know, these days it's like, well, Congress never gets anything done. Here we have a ton of stuff happening in about a 3-month period, which was pretty amazing, you know, considering the situation and the different ideological ideas and political ideas that people had during this time period. So there you have your response to the economic crisis. Remember, think about the ideologies: conservatism, liberalism, radicals, and then take a look at some of these laws that were actually passed when FDR took office with his New Deal in the first 100 days. So here's your essay outline. Take a look at it, know these things, understand them, and this should help you really have a good idea of you know, what these things were and help you organize your thoughts. I hope this helps, and I'll see you in chapter 32.